Welcome everyone to the second of our work in progress seminars from the range of Brigstow projects that are taking place over the course of this year in these slightly strange times, more of which I'm sure the project teams will talk about in a moment. What we're going to do is we're going to hear from a couple of different project teams that are both interested in the question of unearthing hidden histories. And we're going to start with Joe and Clive from Endless Pressure in a moment, and then we'll move on to Mill, Jan and Amber from Stitching, Obsession and Wellness. A little bit about their projects and talk about some of the learning from doing research together, and also offer a few reflections on what it's meant to do research in the last few months in the context of social distancing and the move to online that this is a part of. What we'll do is we'll do one talk followed by a really brief question answer session, then a second talk, very brief question and answer session, and then open up for more questions and answers. But what I'd love to do is say hello to Joe and Clive.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us both. It's great to see you, Clive. Joe's just calling in on a phone line, so we can't see Joe, but we'll be able to hear her loud and clear. And Joe, maybe could I start with you, Joe, just to tell us a little bit about Endless Pressure and what the research project involves.
Right. Hi, Tim. Yeah, thanks for doing this. So it's very strange using technology and everything. Endless Pressure 50 years on, revisiting Ken Pryce's study of the West Indian lifestyles in Bristol. So Ken Pryce was a Jamaican who came over to England, and he worked his way up through studying, and he went to the University of Bristol. I think he was about 27, and decided to do a PhD research of the West Indian lifestyles in Bristol, in St Paul's mainly, and it was a groundbreaking study from grassroots level, really, because he really got into the community for 4 years. He was documenting and recording people's lifestyles in all different areas. So he recorded. It was amazing. It was a very innovative, very unique piece of research that he done, and he categorized the West Indian people in the communities, like hustler, tea boppers, mainliners, as examples of the lifestyles. So he wanted to see the effects of how West Indian people were adapting in their community, and the effects of racism and discrimination, and how they overcame monumental obstacles regarding, racism and discrimination in the community. So I really wanted to get Ken Pryce's research recognised, because it's such a valuable piece of research, and get his work acknowledged, basically, and the contribution that he has added within, the academic field as well as the West Indian community. So his research became a book called Endless Pressure. Mm-hmm. And in that book, it holds a wealth of history of the West Indian community in Bristol. And a lot of people don't know about the book. I mean, the elder West Indian community know, and I think some academics know, but a lot of people nationally don't know about his groundbreaking work. So I really wanted to get that out there and for people to recognise and to see that people could use his book as a reference for history, because it was actually from, the West Indian people's own words. It wasn't from, other outsider people coming in. It was from the grassroots level, which is very unique.
Yeah.
So it was from the people's actually their own voices, basically, their own lives. So that was the first part of the project, to get Ken Pryce's work recognised. And then the second part was revisiting 50 years later of the actual people that were part of the project. Mm-hmm. So that was amazing, coming across the people that were part of the project. So revisiting them and having their stories and testimonies about understanding what Ken Pryce's, if they did understand what Ken Pryce's research was about, and also about their experiences of coming to Britain in the early 70s and their effects of racism and discrimination, really.
Clive, could I turn to you to tell us a little bit more about those interviews? Because I think you were largely involved in undertaking that. You're a filmmaker, training and practice. Could you say a little bit more about who you interviewed and kind of what you found from those?
Well, as you said, I'm a filmmaker. Lucky enough, I was involved in radio, and so due to the climate and what happened, we couldn't do the filming. Mm-hmm. So we had to change things, because it was being turned into a podcast. So it was basically done from taking interviews through audio. And that was where the change, where I had to really use my brain and deal with things in a different way. So a lot of things that we did do was through WhatsApp. Mm-hmm. And because you got to understand, we had people who were in Jamaica and even in Bristol who we couldn't go and see. So I managed to get Jo to get her phone going and say, listen, what you need to do, because she had contact with them through the phone. I said, well, the best way to go around this, because we can't go and see them, because we actually tried it where we did a phone call on WhatsApp before and it kept cutting out. So I thought, right, the next thing to do is let's get the people to send them the messages, like a voice message on WhatsApp, mm-hmm. and then let them reply back. So it was clear and you could get it. And that's what was, that was the format we worked on. And then I would then turn the WhatsApp messages into audio, mm-hmm. and convert everything. So it was longer, it was harder work, but that was the way we had to do it, because we couldn't go and, especially some of them were older, and even some of them we couldn't really get to because they ended up in hospital. So lucky enough, it was just things was unfolding where people were mentioning certain people's names and we managed to get through to them. But it worked out really great, and but it was hard. But when you got that kind of artistic brain, you automatically switch to the next possible thing, and that's what worked.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us, both, either or both of you, how many people in the end did you manage to track down that you could re-interview? And I think especially what would be interesting to know is what kind of reflections did people have about, I guess, change or continuity as members of the West Indian community? Like, did people feel like the book was still relevant, or certain parts of it, or certain, I don't know, their reflections on the experience of being interviewed by Ken Pryce?
Right. Well, what I would say was, I think the project was needed because I can relate to it from me as a filmmaker, and probably the first one or who's known within the Bristol area as well, because I've been filming for over 20 years. But to know that Ken Pryce, what he was doing back from the 60s, 70s, that was groundbreaking, and the way he was doing it as well. Because you've got to understand, for somebody like that to be going around and asking questions to West Indian, or so we say black people from the Caribbean, it wasn't really accepted. And that came across a lot through the interviews that we had. And even when I spoke to certain people, hearing Ken Pryce's name it wasn't really accepted in the way which I accepted it, because I accepted it from being somebody who does filming, and I go out there anyway, and I'm capturing that life of West Indian people through my experience of growing up. And then to know that Ken Pryce had done that, and then the way the book was presented, that's why it was a good job what Jo did, because she looked at it from a different angle, obviously being in university and then reading all the research and all the things that was not in the book. So you found when you'd speak to people, there was people who never received it in a nice way because they saw the book as kind of one-sided. But then the research, what Jo, and you could see what she wanted to get out, was to show this was the full story, the balance of what Ken Pryce was doing. And what was nice was when that was mentioned to the people, a few of the people who we did manage to talk to and get things out, it was like, or they even managed to read the book again. It came out and it was, wow, we didn't realize, because the way the book came out, it wasn't balanced enough. But the research balanced it. That was my opinion. And that was something me and Joe had to work on a lot, because I thought that needed to come out. And we did push that out in certain things within the podcast, how some people felt. But in the end, it was a good thing.
Joe, could any thoughts from you, kind of final thoughts in terms of your own sense of, in a sense, revisiting those voices 50 years later? So some of the original interviewees, when Clive and yourself spoke to them, what their reflections were about change or continuity?
Yeah, the testimonies were very, very moving, and hopefully you're going to get an opportunity, obviously, to listen to the podcast. And Clive has been absolutely fantastic. So he directed me and coached me. Without him, really, I think I would have just thrown in the towel, because obviously it was the first time I was doing this. So I really want to thank Clive for that, really, for 2.5 months work, really, really hard work, and it wasn't easy at all. But it's fantastic, the result. And the only thing is, obviously, if it was a film, there would have been a lot more footage in a film. But because of 6 hours of interviews being reduced to 33 minutes on a podcast, a lot gets, lost. But yeah, the testimonies from the people absolutely, it's very moving, and it's really nice to get people visible that have been invisible, and to hear their contributions to Britain and how they experienced, coming to Britain, and, a bit about their grandparents. So there's quite a lot there, really, and how they dealt with racism and discrimination, which is absolutely really amazing. And, dealing with, being older in today's society, but how they remain so positive about it. And even though there are people through the education system, obviously, were shocked because of the teachers with racism and stuff like that, and obviously through housing, employment. But the difference is, obviously, they were, they did mention, the difference from then and now, how St Paul's has changed, because it was one person describes it was sort of like, a ghetto and run down. So they put all the West Indian people in just one area. But still, I would have loved to have asked them more questions, because obviously with Black Lives Matters that's happened today, and about the brutality of the police then 50 years ago, so has much changed since then, really? So there was a lot of questions that could have come up, and obviously the Windrush scandal that's happening, and, West Indian people, especially Jamaica, being from the British Commonwealth and not feeling part of, Britain, even though they were British, because as one says, they felt more English than the English did, but then when you come to the country and they're not being welcomed or and experience racism. So yeah, they do go into that. Because we couldn't get free of the people that were really vital for the project, we had to get Ken Pryce's academic colleague. So the questions for the academics, Ken Pryce's colleagues, the questions were different. Mm-hmm. So that was the only thing, really.
Yeah. Could I just ask a final question, Clive, to you? And then there's a question coming on Q&A, which I'll just ask. Clive, you're a filmmaker, but in a sense you have turned to sort of almost to old school radio. Could you tell us your own reflections on that, of kind of moving from the visual more towards the audio?
Wow, it's opened up. It's opened up my brain and creativity again, because especially you can see where things are going. And even we're talking now through this Zoom and that. And what happened was we're on video, a picture, a movement can tell a lot of things. Whereas when doing it on podcasts, we had to look, because I also did another project, but we had to, you have to talk and you have to create that story. And that's what I had to do with Jo, because she didn't really want to do narrating. I was going to do it, but I said no, her voice was good. So I had to get her to tell that story and to get out of her what is in your head. Because you have done the academical stories, you have looked through the research and everything, and there was things that was in her head that, because I hadn't gone to university and read it right through, she knew what needed to be done. So that needed to be transferred as audio for people who's listening to the podcast could hear it and visualize what was going on. And that was what, which was very interesting, because you're now having to tell that story without somebody seeing it, and for them to really visualize what was going on. And then the interviews made it very interesting as well. But as Joe said, if you'd used the interviews all the way, because everything was interesting, then the podcast would have never been 30 odd minutes. You might as well just say you're going to do a series, a film. And there's room for that. There's room to do more to it because it's needed. There's room for because there's so many angles to the story, especially with the climate that we're in now. There are so many angles when you hear what they're talking about, how St. Paul's, Bristol is a rundown area, the living and the police, the clubs, and within even those things that was going on, there was more businesses for the Black community, which was run by the Black community. And they had houses and things whereas now it's not there. So to get that story out, you had to do a lot more imagination, you had to be creative and to speak it, whereas as a film and things like that, it would come out even more.
Yeah. Well, in a moment we'll move over to the second project, but there's a couple of questions come through that I just wanted to ask you both to maybe give an answer to. Maybe choose one each or say a little bit, and they pick up a little bit on what you just said, Clive. So the first question was, one of the things you talked about, Clive, was you talked about how you felt the original book wasn't balanced or that it missed certain things out. And there's a question just to maybe say a little bit more about that. If either one of you could elaborate on what was missing or what was not balanced, and in particular how you tried to readdress that. So that's question one. And the second question is, could you say a little bit more, either of you? You mentioned this, Clive, obviously, and Joe, you did as well, in the context of Black Lives Matters, the toppling of the Colston statue, there's a very particular moment. And could you say anything about how that is affecting the community that you've been working with over the last few months, and how far those kind of contemporary issues have resonated, as well as these interviews from 50 years ago?
All right, I'll answer the first one, as in to do with not balanced. There's people who was not part of the book, but they know Ken Pryce. And because I'm very well known in the community, and I've grown up in this community, and I was young then, from certain names, Joe wouldn't have even known. When I would hear some conversations or things on the tape, or just a conversation, and I heard certain names, I can relate to who they are because I know them from the community. So I'd walk around and I'd ask certain people, and thinking they would know certain things I needed to know. And the first thing I just said, do you know Ken Pryce? I can remember having an email come back, didn't like him. He said horrible things about Carmen Beckford. So if you know Bristol, you would know who Carmen Beckford is. And she was well liked by the community because what she did with the race relations and that. And there was people who would comment on things like that. I didn't like her, didn't like this. I didn't like what he wrote about these people. And that was because in the book, it's not in there. Whereas in the research is in there. And I can relate to that. If I say, when I did various projects for the BBC, for instance, and the film had to be half-hour long. I have to explain this so you might get an idea. The film has to be half-hour long. Now, if somebody who is not from the West Indian or the Jamaican community and don't understand what certain meanings are or what certain things, to cut that film down, you will cut out vital things which is needed to balance the movie or the documentary. Whereas in the book, I think it was the same thing. I think the people who was behind the right on putting the book together with Ken, I think certain things that could have balanced it was missed out. Whereas if people had seen it, we wouldn't have had to go into the point of explaining to these people, even when we were interviewing them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
It totally makes sense. And I guess it's really interesting that your project in part has been about, in some ways, letting the book breathe by the work that Joe's been doing in terms of the previous work, as well as kind of bringing it up to date with these second interviews. Now, that totally makes sense. Yeah. Thanks for that, Clive. Yeah. Maybe, Joe, I could just turn to you. Just the final question from Gloria is about how you see the recent events around Black Lives Matter affecting the community, and if that kind of contemporary context came up in the interviews that you and Clive did with members of the community today.
Yeah, I suppose it's to do with racism and discrimination within the systems, and this has always been there for, you know, a very, very long time, from, you know, 50 years ago. So it's like, well, it wasn't a direct question to the elders, but, you know, one or two of them do speak about the raids and how it's endless pressure, that we're still today in the 21st century going through endless pressure. You know, it's hard times, that we're seeing people are still experiencing discrimination, you know, even within, you know, the schooling system to try and get African Caribbean studies in the education and curriculum is a challenge, you know, dealing with the police and how the police relations with the young generation and the prison systems, you know, is endless. You know, that's why it's so endless pressure, you know. But so with Black Lives Matter, how important it is, because obviously 50 years ago, Black lives weren't mattering. And you know, obviously African Americans got this, or Amazing Women got this organisation together and called it Black Lives Matter, because our lives matter across the board, and addressing that. And I think lots of people are waking up, because obviously being a dual heritage Black woman myself and experiencing racism with all different systems, and people actually saying in your face that racism doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's so important to get rid of that ignorance. And I think what's happened now, obviously in the lockdown, people are waking up and realising, you know, the injustices that has been happening for hundreds of years, that we would just be relevant on the 50 years. So with the elders, they do speak about that. One of them does talk about the endless pressure that they're still experiencing today. But because when we actually done the interviews, it wasn't exactly on the same time of what occurred in America. Mm-hmm. So it would have been, you know, there were so many new questions that could have been asked to the elders. And as Clive so rightly says, there's so much scope for this project, and it can get bigger. You know, there's just so many different areas. So yes, within the community, it's still there, but you know, things are changing, and that's what comes out with the elders. But you know, it's on a very slow pace. So it's not. Yeah, so Black Lives Matter, you know, because we're 50 years ago. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in on what Joe was saying, because I'm around the community a lot and hear what's going on. Right now, the situation when it comes to the Black Lives Matters, you got different groups. You got the younger groups who you would say are more British. They don't know much about the Caribbeans or Africa. They have been here, they're that third generation, they're in their 20s, 30s and younger, yeah? They see Black Lives Matters totally different to how the elders, like my age group, and those who went to school here, and those who were a bit older than us in their 60s, 70s and 50s. As you're seeing, it wasn't happening at the time when we were doing the interviews, but what's been going on, the elders and my group are saying, they're not really interested in this Black Lives Matters, because this has been happening to us as a people in England from the 50s and 60s. And yet everybody is now jumping on this thing, what's happened to somebody, even though they feel bad, but it's in America. What about here, which has been going on undercover and still going on. So that is a lot of the conversations you're getting on Facebook, on the other things. What about what we've been going through for all these years? And we came here as British. British passports and all these kind of things. So why are we dealing with issues from America when these issues in England should have been dealt with 50, 60 years ago? So that's the kind of conversation between the older and the youngers.
What was so groundbreaking about Ken Pryce's research is that he predicted the race riots in the 80s.
1980s.
Well, that's what was in the 1980s. So it's like, so it's been continuing to the 21st century. It's still happening. But obviously peaceful demonstrations, which was good, except for London and in America and stuff. But yeah, this project is an education tool for universities, colleges, schools.
So I'm going to invite Madge Dresser to speak.
One of the unexpected pleasures or results of the project was I'm sort of deputed to do a blog about Ken Pryce as an academic and his contributions from from a historian's point of view. And through doing this, I connected up with not only people at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, Ken Pryce's wife, his son, who's a playwright and actor, but also connect them up with people who had been working in Bristol, the son of someone who was working in Bristol as a Rastafarian and a community organizer in the 1970s in Bristol, who then he and his wife went back to Jamaica, had their son, who's now a professor at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, and he didn't realize that there was that connection with Ken Pryce's son. So there's and then connecting up Ken Pryce's son, who's as an actor and playwright investigating his father's life, because he lost his father at 9, to connect him up with some of the academics who knew his father. So it's been a really interesting sort of networking journey that came out of this unexpectedly.
Great, thanks, Madge. Stay on the line, guys. We're going to kind of put on the next project team, but stay on the line because then we might have a chance for a few more questions and comments later. Thanks, Joe and Clive.
Okay, right.
Yeah. What we're going to do is we're going to move over now with the magic of Zoom to our next team. So Merle is joining us, and Jan and Amber. Hi, Merle. Nice to see you again. And what I'll maybe do is invite you, maybe Mill, to kick off and just to say a little bit about the project, just what the sort of central research questions and focus of the project is.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for having us, and thanks to Endless Pressure 50 years on. That was really, really interesting, and I'm going to make sure it goes into our Geography Year 1 syllabus. But to move on to our project, our research is really seeking to explore the therapeutic role of sewing in 19th century asylums and its relevance to contemporary well-being. So we know that mental illness is a leading cause of disability in the UK. However, despite understanding the importance of paid employment, only 67% of those currently suffering from mental illness are employed. And obviously this will have only worsened under COVID. Yet when Glenside Hospital, which was formerly known as Bristol Lunatic Asylum, was operational, 65% of its section patients were usefully employed in a model of moral treatment that promoted the therapeutic effects of occupation. So, for example, women at the asylum had the opportunity to access the labour market and practice a skill through needlework. And from the historic case notes, we know that the note working well at sewing was kind of understood as an indicator for recovery. And so what our research aims to do is to scientifically test the therapeutic benefits of stitching by measuring whether the rhythmic, repetitive action of stitching can calm and focus the anxious brain into a meditative state. And through this, what we seek to do is contribute to a re-evaluation of the 19th century asylum as a therapeutic space. But as well as assessing the therapeutic value of productive needlework, our research will also explore practices of non-productive, or what we are terming subversive needlework within the 19th century asylums. And these displayed emotional or creative expression, and Jan's going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute. So the research question as a team that we're asking together is, can both the productive stitch and the subversive stitch be understood as therapeutic? So by assessing the therapeutic and emotional role of needlework in the 19th century asylum, we aim to deepen our understanding of the relationship between women, creative work, and wellness more broadly. So we've got a fantastic team to help answer that and address that question. So I'm a human geographer at Bristol, and I'm interested in examining historical geographies of craftwork, skill, and apprenticeship, and I'm particularly interested in the historic gendering of skill. Then we have Jan Connett, who's an independent textile artist and works with Bristol Health Partners. Now, she's interested in behaviours that tip between self-support and obsession, and she's going to be working collaboratively to understand and interpret the intent of 19th century stitchers and the contribution of their creativity to their well-being. Amber Roguski is a Bristol-based neuroscientist, and she's co-designing and carrying out EEG experiments to investigate the potential effects of stitching on emotions. Then we also have Anne-Will Cooper-Willis, who's an independent artist and researcher from Glenside Hospital Museum, and she brings an extensive knowledge of the history of Glenside Hospital Museum and its relationship with sewing. Then we have Stella Mann, who's an independent artist again and curator at Glenside Hospital Museum, and she has extensive experience of involving people in projects and leading co-produced workshops, including our own EEG workshops. And finally, we have Naomi Clark, who is our PhD intern from education, and she's interested in exploring and recording the narratives of people engaged in needed work, particularly under COVID-19. So that's us, that's the team, and that's just generally what we're interested in exploring through our project.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you. A great team. And I love the idea of productive and subversive stitching.
Yeah.
There's kind of like ways of thinking about the different stitching. Maybe, Jan, could I bring you in to say a little bit about what you've discovered so far, just to kind of talk us through what you feel like as a team you're beginning to discover?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Tim. So my starting point is this beguiling jacket that was made by Agnes Richter, who was a patient in one of the 19th century German asylums. And it's stitched all over, inside and out, with what appears to be repetitive autobiographical text. And the wording's disjointed, and parts of it are indecipherable. And so the stitching, because it's on both sides of the fabric, in places impinges from one side to the other, which makes it really difficult to read. But this style of stitched narrative isn't unique to Agnes's jacket. I've seen it elsewhere, and not always in clothing. Sometimes they're stitched panels. But what they seem to have in common is this frenetic energy. So they're rants or petitions, with the patients railing impotently against their perceived unfair incarceration, and in a seemingly unhearing system. So there's this sense that the patients felt that there was no way out for them. And that made me want to know more about the 19th century asylums. So I went to Glenside Hospital Museum, which is where the old Bristol lunatic asylum was. And I met Stella, and she pretty much floored me with her hypothesis, which is that far from being punitive places, the asylums were designed to be places of refuge, comfort, support, and rehabilitation. And what we've now found through Anne-Will's research is that the documentation supports Stella's assertion. And we're incredibly lucky in Bristol that there's a really rich resource held partly at the museum and partly at Bristol Archive. So there we can see individual patient case notes and also the annual reports of the superintendents. And there, Anne-Will's been able to see that in Bristol, occupation was seen to be an ordered part of life that would aid recovery of the disordered brain, which is a lovely expression. And that large numbers of patients, the women, were working, as Merle said, and they were working in the sewing rooms. And that, again, as Merle said, sewing was seen as a measure of patients' recovery. So that begs the question for us, is the quiet stitching in the setting of a 19th century asylum just an indication of obedience and conformance? Or is the act of stitching in itself calming and self-soothing? And if that's the case, how can we evidence its effect? So then just quickly going on to the public workshops, that we'll run, what we next discovered is that actually there's a great appetite for this research. So our first 3 proposed workshops were fully recruited almost immediately. And time again, women were saying to us that they knew instinctively that their stitching calmed them, but that they were eager to find out whether the neuroscience experiments would bear that out. Thanks.
Which is where this leads perfectly to Amber, in a sense, the kind of discovery. Amber, do you want to kind of fill us in on the next bit of the story? And I guess this is a part where the story does become a little bit more maybe complicated by the COVID context, which has impact on you as a neuroscientist.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my main contribution to this project is to collect and analyse the brain activity data from women during sewing workshops, which we organised. To see what effect that sewing can have on the brain state. So to do this, we use electroencephalography, which is also called EEG. So I thought I'd very quickly introduce that just in case people aren't familiar with this technology. So the neurons in our brains all communicate with one another using electrical signals, and the functions and general state of our brain can therefore be characterised by the pattern of these signals. So EEG is essentially just placing a lot of electrodes all over someone's scalp, and then you can detect and record the electrical patterns of the brain. So other previous studies have shown that repetitive behaviours such as tics and even chewing gum can reduce anxiety levels, while EEG and functional MRI imaging studies have shown that meditation and repetitive stimuli like listening to mantra, they lead to a slower and a calmer brain activity pattern. So that feeds in very nicely with the idea that if you're repetitively stitching, that your brain activity might sort of calm down and sort of slow and enter a calm state. So we planned these 3 workshops where we would have women sewing for 20 minutes while we record their brain activity. So they have this little EEG cap on their heads. And then we also record a baseline activity as well, where they're just sat there doing nothing, so that we can compare how the stitching activity does change their brain activity, hopefully. So prior to the pandemic, as Jan said, we had all the workshops all ready to go. People signed up, and I got the ethical approval from the university, so it was definitely going to happen. But then, we had to obviously stop all of that because the university it's not supporting non-essential human participant research at the moment, quite rightly, which means that now the workshops will have to be rebooked and reorganised. And also we've looked at whether we would need to change our participant group. So this was originally, the majority of participants were older women taking part, whereas after all of this, it might be more appropriate to have a younger participant cohort, just to minimise the risk of sort of ill health on an older population. So that's sort of where we are at, that everything was ready to go with EEG and nothing could happen. So I'm waiting, very enthusiastically for some EEG to happen soon.
Could I ask a question to all of you or any of you? Because what's really striking about this project, I think partly there's this incredible movement that I sense, almost a movement from kind of subversive productive into thinking harder about productive stitching. So there's a sense in which the project itself has evolved and is continuing to evolve because of the conditions. But it's also striking that this project is one that uses a very diverse range of research methods and involves a very kind of broad range of people who are everything from, say, arts-based, practice-based researchers through to neuroscientists. And Merle, if you don't mind putting you somewhere in between those kind of poles as a human geographer, a historical geographer, what have been your own kind of, your own learning or reflections on being involved in a project that's so radically interdisciplinary and also kind of very, very much co-produced between academics and artists and makers and museum curators? Personally, as a neuroscientist, then often, I spend a lot of my time looking at really minutiae of a little signal. So it's been really
brilliant for me to work with people from other disciplines and have those kind of conversations about the broader context of the work, because sort of any biological or behavioural mechanism, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it's always going to be influenced by the environment and context that it's taking place in. So this has really given a huge wealth of historical context to something which is quite a simple act of just stitching. So for me, it's been absolutely brilliant, and how all the different themes of this project tied together. It's just, fantastic.
It's been brilliant to be challenged. So I had a particular view of what the asylums were like, and the patients living in them. And the writings that I'd seen and the textiles I'd seen all had this feel of pent-up anger and desperation. And so to hear a very different thesis of the ethos and culture was, just amazing to hear that. And also all of us working together and listening to each other instead of hanging on to our initial ideas meant that the discussions could flow in all sorts of directions. And that was how the idea of using neuroscience evolved. And it'll be great to see what comes out of those readings, and how then we might be able to visualise them and create new artworks based on those results, whatever they turn out to be. But I think as well, for me, having those tensions of the different views and reputations of the 19th century asylums, and understanding that two very different states can simultaneously exist. So the subversive and the anger and the calming influence can both happen at the same time. And so in my work now, trying to think how those layered and contradictory narratives could be visualised and described. And that's what I'd like to start exploring or continue to explore.
Great. Anything to add, Mel, on that sense of your own kind of journey of encountering these quite different perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, it's been fantastic to work with all the lovely ladies on the project and, gain the insight and knowledge from their different perspectives, and particularly to think about, well, as a historical geographer, I do a lot of archival work, I read a lot of narratives, and it's very interesting to read the case notes, but then it's also so exciting within neuroscience to actually test an actual historical hypothesis that it did aid recovery, but now we can actually actually test that in some sort of way is quite exciting. But at the same time, not just to be using neuroscience, actually keeping those kind of tensions in play, and having those layered narratives, like Jan said, is really, really important. And just creating that deeper sense of context, and keeping those kind of really nice tensions between past and present, and how the past lives in the present. I think that was nicely illustrated by the last project as well. And the idea of hidden histories, again, kind of reclaiming women's histories, which are kind of often forgotten. And what's exciting particularly about the subversive stitch is often, it was men's work in asylums that was seen as artwork. So they were often given, a plein air painting to do, and their work's very much being collected, whereas women's work has kind of been sidelined. And because they were doing needlework, it wasn't really seen as artwork per se. So there's a really nice sense of reclamation in this project as well, which I really like, and really putting these women's lives, their narratives to the fore as well. So it's not just an EEG reading. Hopefully we will be, through Anwell's work, into the archives and bringing out the stories of women, both in the past but in the present too, because Naomi would like to record the women who are going to be involved in our stitching workshops now. So it'll be interesting to kind of have these different narratives emerging and really hearing these stories and letting them shine.
There's that sense of, like, you kind of start moving into a project and then it kind of goes in all sorts of directions that are unexpected. And the thing I'm really struck by, Jan, when you were speaking especially, is a kind of a really refreshing openness to have your assumptions challenged. which I think is maybe one of the kind of hallmarks of any sort of interdisciplinary or co-produced research, or hopefully any research more generally, but especially these kinds of bigger collaborative projects, is that it feels to me that you kind of go in with a hypothesis, but actually you welcome the chance for your hypothesis to be challenged and to kind of take this research in a different direction.
Yeah, and I think in my own work with Bristol Health Partners, a lot of that work is about bringing together people who don't realise that they're working on the same issue, but are looking at it from completely different perspectives. So for me in this project, to have the opportunity to hear people who work in completely different disciplines, and Merle, I'm afraid I'd never heard of historical geography, but it makes absolute sense. Sort of looking at objects and finding a way to understand their makers and their intent. And I'm for Agnes, not just making the jackets, but then wearing it almost to destruction. So it must have been some kind of comfort to her. And then, looking at the work that Amber's doing, and seeing what new richness that can bring to what we're doing. I've just found it incredibly exciting. So thank you for the opportunity.
What I'll do, we've got just a few minutes left, so we'll bring Joe and Clive back in, and we'll keep Merle and Jan and Amber as well here. And I don't know if anyone's got any final questions, or if either of the groups have questions for each other.
It was just to the Endless Pressure team. I just wondered if you found there were any sort of difficulties. Obviously, Ken Pryce had passed away. I'm not sure when that happened. But did you find any sort of difficult? I mean, obviously, Madge, you were saying you met up with his son and so on and so forth. But were there any sort of ethical dilemmas or just difficulties that you ran into, because it's still such a sort of even though it's 50 years ago, it's still such a live project, and it's linked to obviously the people who are still living and so forth.
I had no difficulties other than what I explained, people's perception of how they felt when they first read the book. I think that's what it was, just the perception of how it came across when the book first came out. That is what it was to be, and that's what I was putting over to Joe a lot, because I was out there and I can hear it. They're talking to me direct, whereas with Joe, they wouldn't have probably known her that much, and I would voice it to her every time I was told that. So that was that. I think there may be a couple that wanted to say certain things, but they didn't. They were being very, 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 very polite, because there are issues of how he died, and there's various certain things as well. And, within a community like ours, when you're seen as either you're working for the system, you're working with the police or whatever it is, you're seen as an informer. And I know that firsthand when I started filming, he's an informer, because you don't see black guys with a camera walking around, whereas now everybody's walking around with a phone. You can film, you can act. But for me, 20, nearly 30 years ago, you walking around with a camera, you're seen as somebody, dangerous. And I think Ken went through that back in those days, and that was just asking information.
Yeah.
And so I'd just like to add, I suppose the ethics from 50 years ago, when sociologists or any researchers went out field studying, they didn't have consent forms like they do now, with the policies and procedures. So a lot of, because it's really, really raw, the research in Endless Pressure. So people, even though he used alias names, people still recognise who they are. So he wrote, he obviously in that time, but it was for a lot of academics in that time that they didn't get consent forms to consent to say, we're going to use your material, what you're saying, and I'm going to publish it. So when he was recording, he was using word by word by what a person was saying. So, and then people go, gosh, so that was the only thing that I was thinking back then, really, 50 years ago.
One question that's come in for a couple of people is just, can you tell us when we can hear the podcast and where we can hear the podcast?
Yeah, I think because Madge is doing the blog and Julia was doing the website, I think I think Julia wanted to put it all together at the end of this month, and then it's all together, and I think we was waiting for the contract and the copyright or something. So hopefully at the end of this month, when everything's come together, so it's all together. Yeah.
Great. So what we'll make sure we get it all up on the on your project page on the Brigstow website as soon as we get everything together. So we should have a blog from Madge. I think Julia O'Connell-Davidson might be running a blog post as well, a little bit on Ken Pryce's work as a sociologist, and then we'll have the podcast from Clive and Joe, and we'll make sure we let people know about that through Brigstow Matters. Just one final question that's come in for Merle and Jan and Amber. Are there any plans to connect with other groups, such as political groups using stitching for protest? Because that's obviously one of the things that's been really interesting is the way that actually stitching is used. The kind of subversive stitch also has a sort of very strong history, a global history within political protest movements. And I don't know if there's any connections with that.
I was just going to say that the original pool of participants were from stitching groups already, but as far as I'm aware, there weren't any plans to sort of look beyond into other sort of organised stitching groups as well. But maybe Jan has
yeah, that's right. In the past, I've looked at the trade unions banners because they're an amazing range and really interesting, and there's a great collection of them at Swansea University, so I've looked at them there. I don't think in this particular project we're going to have time to do that, but yeah, I noticed at the Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol, some of those banners were stitched, so that was interesting to see. But yeah, and it's another great avenue.
Yeah. Just to pick up on that, we'd kind of discussed things about the subversive stitch and also looking at, I guess, more maybe for publications or later work, thinking about the broader context of subversive stitching, particularly within contemporary art, particularly women artists. You see that being used, but also in garment workers. So you had the garment workers who were putting stitches, telling their stories into garments, which happened relatively recently. So that's another kind of angle of that idea of the subversive stitch. So there's lots of really interesting, like you say, more globalized histories around subversive stitching, which certainly when we come to maybe publish or write something up, that we would connect these stories to, or at least set it within a broader context of subversive stitching.
Brilliant. I just finished with, there's a lovely comment from Stella, who is part of the team. So Stella's from the Glenside Museum. And Stella just says that she really wanted to echo your summary and the pleasure that they take as a museum in interrogating and honouring 19th century patients whose lives have been ignored. And I guess like Joe and Clive and Julia and Madge's project, what's great about these two projects is that these attempts, I guess, are almost a kind of excavation of a couple of histories that are actually really important histories with the Bristol city region and far beyond, as Jan mentioned, in terms of going to the German asylums that piqued her interest. That these are great projects in terms of unearthing these histories that, as I guess we've discovered just over the last hour, proved to be far more complex than maybe we initially imagined, and take us in all of these kinds of rich dimensions which have this very contemporary relevance and resonance to them. So thank you to all of you. Thanks so much for your generosity in sharing these two projects with us this afternoon. Thanks everyone for questions. We'll be back on Friday with another work in progress, and we're going to turn to mapping. So mapping as a kind of methodology for unearthing pasts and also thinking about present. So that's going to be coming up very soon. But for now, I think it's time to say goodbye. Take care, everyone, and thanks so much to all the panelists. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Goodbye, Tim. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. It was lovely to hear your project from Joe.
Yes, you too, Joe.
And yours.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.